Welcome to Creepy Vibes. Tonight we're stepping into the heart of the unknown, where shadows stretch long and the air grows thick with stories of the dark, from haunted forests that never let go to forgotten graves that still whisper at night. We've got 5 of the creepiest, most disturbing true horror stories that'll make you question what's real and what's still lurking just out of sight. But before we begin, there's something you need to know. Most viewers make one massive mistake. They leave without subscribing. And by doing that, they miss out on the spine-chilling, heart-stopping tales that only the boldest dare to hear. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button now. The night is far from over, and the terror that's waiting in the shadows is just getting started. So, where are you watching from, and what time is it on your end? Drop your answers in the comments below, because right now the night is unfolding, and you won't want to miss what's about to happen. Now let's venture into the darkness. Marissa had always dreamed of a home to call her own, a place where she could escape the noise of the world and breathe. She'd saved every penny, taken on extra shifts at the diner, and finally managed to buy it, a fixer-upper in a small, quiet town nestled in the Maine woods. The house was far from perfect, but it had a charm to it, and the price had been right. The previous owners, the Lamberts, had left in a hurry, leaving Marissa with a bit of mystery and a whole lot of work. The first night, as she sat on the worn couch, sipping a glass of wine, she felt a kind of peace she hadn't known in years. The kind of quiet that seeped into your bones and made you feel like the world had forgotten you, just for a little while. She had big plans for the house, a new coat of paint, fresh carpet, and maybe even a vegetable garden out back. But as she lay there, staring at the low, slanted ceiling, she heard something. At first, it was just the old house settling, creaks in the walls, groans from the wooden beams. But then it started, a soft scraping sound, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. Marissa sat up. The sound came from somewhere below, muffled by the old floors. It wasn't rats. It was too slow, too deliberate. She stood and tried to pinpoint the source, pacing through the small, dimly lit house. The noise echoed through the hallways, faint but unmistakable. She tried to ignore it. The house was old, after all, and old houses had their quirks. But each night the sound grew louder. It crawled beneath the floorboards, weaving through the walls like something trying to find its way out. At first, Marissa thought it was just the house settling, but as the days passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, something alive. After a week of sleepless nights, she called pest control. The technician came with his tool belt and a flashlight, promising to sort out any critters. He spent hours under the house, poking around the crawl space, inspecting vents and ducts, checking for nests. But when he came back up, he gave her an apologetic smile. "Nothing, ma'am. No sign of vermin, no leaks, no sign of anything at all." He left, shaking his head, and Marissa was left with the silence of her own growing dread. Still, she tried to go on with her life. It was just an old house, after all. A little strange, maybe, but nothing to be afraid of. She focused on her work and the renovation, spending her days stripping wallpaper and replacing broken tiles. But the sound never stopped. One day, while removing a cracked tile in the laundry room, Marissa's crowbar scraped against something unusual. It was soft, like cardboard or fabric, not the usual solid concrete she'd been expecting. With a quick tug, she lifted the tile. Beneath it was a small, narrow gap. It wasn't much, just enough space for a crawl space, but something about it felt wrong. She hesitated, then dropped to her knees and shined her flashlight into the dark opening. There was something inside, something old. A mattress lay in the far corner of the crawl space, the fabric torn and stained with age. Scattered around it were empty food wrappers, crumpled and yellowed, like they'd been abandoned in a hurry. But it was the notebook that caught her eye. It was thin, leather-bound, the pages curled and browned with age. Marissa reached for it with a trembling hand, flipping it open to the first page. It was written in thick, messy handwriting, the ink smeared in places as though the writer had hurried. The first words jumped out at her, cold and cruel. "She still doesn't know I'm here." Marissa's heart hammered in her chest as she read the words again. She could feel a weight settle in her stomach, something dark and oppressive. She tried to tell herself it was just the ramblings of someone who had lived here before. A tenant, maybe. But the longer she stared at those words, the more they seemed to crawl into her skin, like something alive, something that didn't belong in her house. Her first instinct was to call the police, but when she did, they didn't seem as concerned as she thought they should. They sent someone out to take a look, but the officer's dismissive tone left her uneasy. The crawlspace was just a forgotten corner of the house, they said. Nothing to worry about. And when they searched the records for the house's previous tenants, they found nothing. No one named Lambert had lived there for years, and no one had been reported missing in the town. It was like the house had swallowed them whole. Still, something gnawed at her. Late one night, when she couldn't sleep, she started digging. She went to the town hall and started searching old records, deeds, any trace of the house's past. What she uncovered made her blood run cold. There was no mention of the Lamberts at all, not a single name tied to the property. And that's when she found it, the note from an old case file. A young man named Derek Porter, a quiet man who had lived in the house for months before disappearing. The file was sparse and the details were vague, but the last line stuck with her. Porter was last seen in the crawlspace of the property, presumed dead. Marissa felt the room spin around her. The words were starting to make sense now. The crawling noise, the unsettling feeling that something was there with her, the writing in the notebook. Derek Porter hadn't just disappeared. He had been living beneath the house all along. The police later confirmed that someone had indeed been living in the crawlspace for at least 2 months before she moved in. But that wasn't all. There was something even darker in the corners of their investigation. Derek Porter's body had never been found. And as for the house, it was as if he had never left. Sometimes Marissa thinks she still hears him down there, late at night, crawling, watching, waiting. She doesn't go into the crawlspace anymore, but every now and then, she'll find a note. A small scrap of paper wedged under the door or tucked between the floorboards. The handwriting is the same, messy, urgent. It always says the same thing. She still doesn't know I'm here. Eli Peterson had never been one for antiques. He wasn't the type to wander through dusty shops or get sentimental about things that had outlived their usefulness. But there was something about the old radio he found at the flea market that caught his eye. It was a 1950s model, wooden frame, brass knobs, and a crackling grill that gave it an air of mystery. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, he felt a strange tingling, like the radio was waiting for him. Like it had always been there, waiting to be touched. It was only $5, and the old man running the booth didn't seem to care much about selling it. He just leaned back in his chair, staring off into the distance like he wasn't even aware Eli was there. $5 and it's yours, the man said, not even looking up. Eli bought it on a whim. Maybe it was the weather, the thick, oppressive fog hanging over the market that morning. Or maybe it was just the allure of something so worn and strange. But as he walked out with the radio under his arm, he didn't think much of it. Not at first. He set the radio up in his small living room that evening, marveling at its worn beauty. It didn't look like much. Certainly not a piece of history worth cherishing, but something about it felt right, almost as if it belonged to him. He plugged it in, twisted the dial. Static. That thick, heavy kind that made the air feel dense, like the radio was struggling to wake up. Eli fiddled with the knobs, turning the dial through the frequencies. But it wasn't until he reached the far end of the spectrum that the static cleared. A voice crackled through the speakers, sharp and clear, but so faint, so distant, it was almost like the air itself had spoken. October 23, 1974. President Ford's visit to the Midwest. Eli blinked, confused. The voice continued, rattling off news headlines from decades ago, things he'd read in history books, things he'd seen on the History Channel late at night. News from a world he could barely connect to, like listening to a ghost narrating the past. He turned the dial again, trying to get a clearer station, but it just kept coming back to the same frequency, the same dead voices. Then a name. Eli Peterson. Eli's blood ran cold. He'd heard his name. Not just any name, but his name. The voice came through again, louder this time. His pulse quickened, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. His heart was hammering in his chest. The voice on the radio was coming through too clearly now. Eli Peterson. Eli didn't move for a long moment, his fingers frozen on the dial. He knew this was impossible. He wasn't some local celebrity. He wasn't important. He was just a regular guy, nothing more than another mechanic in the small town of Camden, Maine. But the voice didn't stop. It kept speaking. Brother John Peterson. A car accident. July 14th, 1992. The name of his brother, John. The news of John's death. He'd never told anyone about that accident. It was a piece of his life he kept buried, locked away. The voice continued, describing the accident, the car spinning out of control, the blood on the asphalt, the way his brother had gone silent before the paramedics arrived. A memory he hadn't thought about in years. Eli's hands shook, and he yanked the plug from the socket. Silence. Just the dull thrum of his own heartbeat in his ears. He stood there for a long time, staring at the radio like it was a snake coiled in his living room, waiting to strike again. But it didn't. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every time he closed his eyes, the voice from the radio haunted him. He kept thinking about the words that had been said. Car accident. 4:37 a.m. Eli Peterson. The next morning, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Something gnawed at him, a deep-seated, visceral feeling that he needed to do something. But what? The radio was just a stupid piece of junk, right? Just static and old voices. Nothing real. Nothing worth losing his mind over. But the more he thought about it, the more it seemed impossible to ignore. The voice had been so specific. Eli Peterson. 4:37 a.m. car crash. He couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just random. It wasn't just a ghost of some old station drifting across the airwaves. And so he did what anyone would do in his position. He took the radio outside. He dug a hole in the woods behind his house, deep enough that the earth would swallow it whole. Maybe that would be the end of it. He buried the radio there, in the damp earth, and walked away. That night he went about his life, trying to forget about the unsettling experience. He even joked about it to his co-workers at the garage, making light of it. After all, it was just an old piece of equipment, right? Nothing to be afraid of. But the next morning, just as dawn was breaking, Eli woke with a start. The clock on his bedside table read 4:36 a.m. His stomach twisted. He couldn't remember why. But then, just as the clock ticked to 4:37, it hit him. The deer. He was halfway down the road when it happened. A deer darting out from the trees caught in the glow of his headlights. He swerved, the tires screeching on the wet pavement. The car careened off the road, inches from a tree, his heart hammering in his chest. He barely stopped in time. For a moment, he just sat there, breathing heavily, staring at the tree that he should have hit, the thudding of his pulse in his ears. The radio wasn't on his mind until he came home later that day. It was there, sitting on the porch, like it had been waiting for him. New, fresh, gleaming. The dial was already set to the same station. Eli's hand shook as he reached for it, but before he could turn it on, he heard it. The soft hum of the speakers, like it was breathing. And he knew, without a doubt, it had been waiting for him to come back. Nina had never planned on working the night shift. But after she'd moved to the small town of Whitlock, far from the noise of the city with its promises of anonymity, she had no choice. She'd taken the job at St. Mark's psychiatric facility because the hours were flexible and the pay, though modest, helped cover her rent. Plus, the night shift was always quiet. Too quiet, she sometimes thought. But it was a good way to earn a paycheck without much trouble. The hospital, though, was another matter. It had been in operation for decades, a hulking old structure that had seen better days. The walls were scuffed, the floors creaked with every step. It was slated for closure in a few months, a victim of the state's budget cuts, and there were rumors swirling that the place was haunted. Nina didn't put stock in that kind of talk, but there was something about St. Mark's that got under her skin. Maybe it was the smell of antiseptic that never quite masked the underlying rot. Maybe it was the rooms that seemed to swallow light, or the old halls that echoed with something just out of reach. But whatever it was, Nina had learned to avoid it, to keep her head down and her attention focused on the work. That was until one particular night. It was nearing 3 a.m., when Nina was doing rounds, checking the intake board for new admissions. The board was usually filled with names of patients she didn't know, forgotten souls who'd been left behind by families or the world outside. But tonight there was something different. There was a name, John Darrow, scribbled hastily on the board under Patient 441. She frowned. She'd worked here for months, and she knew the usual patients. There was no John Darrow on the list. She checked again, but the name was still there. Patient 441. No chart, no file, just a name. Her heart skipped. She checked the time. 3:05 a.m. It was the dead of night, and it was quiet. Too quiet. The only sound was the soft hum of the overhead lights, flickering every now and then, like a heartbeat. Something about the name unsettled her. It was like the air shifted, a cold draft moving through the corridor, as if the building itself was watching her. But she shook it off. There were protocols, after all. If someone had been admitted, the paperwork had to be somewhere. She made her way down the hall to room 12. It was the last room on the left, just past the nurse's station. The door was closed, but it wasn't locked. Nina hesitated before she opened it. The room smelled faintly of mildew and disinfectant. But it was the figure sitting in the chair by the window that made her stop. A man. His clothes were worn, his hair unkempt. His face was pale, too pale, and his eyes seemed too wide. He was staring out the window, his gaze fixed on something she couldn't see. But when he heard her footsteps, he turned. His smile was slow, almost too slow, like something waking up after a long, long sleep. "You're the first one to see me in years," he said, his voice rough, like he hadn't spoken in a long time. His eyes flicked to the door behind her, and for a moment she thought she saw something, something dark and glimmering in them. But when he spoke again, his voice was calm. "It's okay. I've been waiting." Nina's heart thudded in her chest. She couldn't explain it, but everything about the man felt wrong. She stepped back, confused. Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling despite herself. He smiled again, the same slow, eerie grin. "John Darrow. Room 12. He nodded toward the bed where the covers were bunched up, as though someone had been lying there recently. "Come now, don't be afraid. I've been waiting for someone to talk to." Nina's mind raced. There was something about this that didn't make sense. There shouldn't have been anyone in room 12, not for years. She turned then and walked out, her skin prickling with the sensation of eyes on her back. The rest of the night passed in a haze. She couldn't stop thinking about the man, John Darrow, and the way he'd spoken. She checked the records again. The intake sheet, the patient files, the logbook. Nothing. No mention of a John Darrow. No paperwork. It was as if he didn't exist. The next morning, when the shift ended, she went to her supervisor, Joan, an older woman with thinning gray hair. She didn't want to sound crazy, but something was wrong. She needed answers. Joan didn't react the way Nina expected. Her face went pale, her lips trembling. "John Darrow." Joan's voice cracked. She swallowed hard, looking over her shoulder, as though she expected someone to be standing there, watching. She lowered her voice as if the walls themselves might hear. "That room's been locked since the fire. The fire that happened, 12 years ago now?" Nina felt her stomach drop. "They told us he died in the fire," Joan whispered, her voice shaking. "John Darrow. He was the last one, the one who didn't make it out. That room's been empty ever since." Nina's thoughts spun, dizzying. The fire. She knew about the fire. It had been in the news. But John Darrow's name had never come up in the official reports. The more she thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. She had seen him. She had spoken to him. Later that week, Nina put in her resignation. She couldn't stay. Not after what she'd seen. The feeling of eyes watching her, following her everywhere she went. The voice of John Darrow in her mind, repeating over and over again, "Please don't leave me alone again." She tried to move on, to forget about Saint, Marks. But every night she'd wake up to a cold sweat, to the feeling that room 12 was still waiting for her. Sometimes when the house is silent and the wind howls outside, she swears she can hear a faint whisper on the edge of her hearing. A voice soft but insistent, calling from just beyond the dark. Please don't leave me alone again. And she knows deep in her bones that John Darrow hasn't left. Not really. Claire and Dan had been waiting for this moment for years. After the struggles and uncertainty, the long nights and quiet prayers, they finally had their child, a perfect little girl named Emma. She was everything they'd dreamed of. Healthy, beautiful. Her eyes were like her mother's, and her smile had a way of melting Dan's heart every time he looked at her. The nursery had been their labor of love. Hand-painted walls in soft hues of lavender and mint, a crib that Dan had spent hours assembling, and a mobile that played a lullaby when the wind blew through the window. They were new parents, a little tired, a little overwhelmed, but filled with joy. Still, there were nights when the house felt eerily quiet, the stillness pressing in on them as if the silence itself was waiting for something. They installed the baby monitor when Emma was 3 months old, just to be safe. It was a top-of-the-line model, one that not only had a video feed but motion and sound detection as well. The camera was discreet, tucked in the corner of the room, barely visible unless you knew where to look. It gave them a sense of peace, knowing they could always check in on Emma, even from the other room. It was that first night, just after midnight, that Claire and Dan found themselves slipping into sleep with a sense of quiet contentment. The world outside their bedroom felt far away, quiet, peaceful. But at 2:13 a.m., they were jolted awake by the soft buzz of the baby monitor turning on. Claire blinked, disoriented. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the monitor on their nightstand. The voice came through the speakers. "Shh, go back to sleep." It was a low male voice, calm, almost soothing, but with an undercurrent of something strange, something wrong. Claire's heart leapt into her throat, her breath catching in her chest. She sat up quickly, the sheets tangling around her. Dan's eyes flickered open at the sound, his hand already reaching for the bedside lamp. "What the hell was that?" Claire whispered, her voice thick with panic. Dan was already out of bed, running toward the nursery. His feet slapped against the hardwood floor, fast and frantic. Claire followed him, her mind racing with thoughts she didn't want to acknowledge. The nursery door was locked, just as it should be. Dan fumbled with the knob, turning it with shaking hands. It clicked open, and he rushed inside. The room was dark, bathed in moonlight streaming through the window. But there was no one there, not a single person. Emma was in her crib, sleeping soundly, her tiny face serene and peaceful. She was smiling. Dan froze in the doorway, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. He couldn't move. The baby monitor had been silent now, but the voice was still fresh in his mind. "Shh, go back to sleep." Claire stood in the doorway, trembling. "What the hell is going on?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Dan stepped closer to the crib, checking every corner of the room. The windows were shut. The door was locked. No one had entered the room. The silence was suffocating. Emma's smile seemed to grow wider. Her eyes were closed, but there was something unsettling about her expression. It was almost as if she knew something they didn't. As if she were not alone. Dan didn't know what to say. He reached for the baby monitor, holding it in his hand as if it were a foreign object. Claire, still standing in the doorway, had already pulled up the camera footage on her phone. The video was perfectly still. Emma, asleep in her crib, her small form rising and falling with each breath. But the audio was unmistakable. The voice, low, calm, was clear. "Shh, go back to sleep." The hairs on Claire's arms stood up, and she felt a cold chill sweep through her body. "We have to get out of here," she said, her voice small and terrified. Dan didn't argue. The next morning, they called a real estate agent. They didn't care about the details. They didn't care about the house. They just wanted out. They packed everything up, sold the house, and moved out within the week. They took Emma with them, of course. She was their priority. They found a place on the other side of town, one that was quieter, away from the noise of the past few days. They told themselves it was a new start, but they couldn't escape the monitor. It was a few days after they'd settled in when Claire opened the box, the one that contained all the baby gear they had brought with them. It had been packed away, sealed up tight, the box taped shut. She opened it slowly, her hands trembling as she pulled out the monitor. There was no reason to keep it, not after everything that had happened. She was about to toss it in the trash when, before she could reach the bin, the monitor buzzed on again. A soft, almost imperceptible noise, but it was there. Claire dropped the monitor, her heart racing. Dan rushed into the room when he heard her gasp. He looked at the monitor, his face pale. It was 2:13 a.m. "Shh, go back to sleep." The voice came through, clear and unmistakable. Dan looked at the monitor, his mouth dry. There was no way they'd plugged it in. They hadn't even set it up. It was packed away, sealed up in a box, untouched. But it was on. The voice was there. Every night at 2:13 a.m., without fail, the monitor turned on, the same words repeating, the same eerie calm in the voice. "Shh, go back to sleep." And Emma, now a little older, still smiled. Caleb had always been the kind of guy who couldn't sit still. A weekend hiker at heart, he'd roam the mountains of New Hampshire, the woods of Maine, and the back roads of Massachusetts. But the moment he'd heard about the trail in Vermont, the one the locals swore didn't exist, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had to find it. He didn't know why. It was just one of those urges, the kind you can't ignore no matter how strange. The town of Orford was small, its people tight-lipped, as small towns often are. Caleb had arrived at dusk, a light dusting of fog hanging over the sleepy streets. He'd gone to the general store to pick up some supplies, but when he'd asked about the trail, the shopkeeper's face had hardened, and her words came out in a low, almost conspiratorial tone. "Don't follow the whistling, you hear me?" she warned, her voice rough, like she hadn't spoken in days. "That trail, there's a reason it's not on any map. Don't go looking for it. And whatever you do, don't follow the whistling. That's how it finds you." Caleb hadn't taken her seriously. People in small towns were always talking in cryptic riddles, trying to scare you off from the things you wanted to see. But something in her voice, the way her hand shook as she handed him his change, gave him pause. He shrugged it off, as one does. Maybe she was just lonely or had too many stories running through her head. But then the next morning, with his pack slung over his shoulder and his boots crunching against the earth, Caleb found the trail. It was hidden deep in the woods, covered by overgrown brush and thick trees, as though the earth itself was trying to keep it secret. No markers, no signposts. Nothing to indicate it was anything more than a forgotten deer path. Still, there it was. And despite what he'd been told, Caleb felt an odd pull to follow it. The first day was uneventful. The trail wound through thick underbrush, around boulders, and through narrow, winding paths. He encountered nothing out of the ordinary, save for the occasional rustle in the trees or the distant sound of birds. By evening he had set up camp, the fire crackling as he ate his dried food and looked up at the canopy of trees above him. The night was still, almost unnaturally so, as if the woods were holding their breath. It wasn't until the second day that he heard it. A faint whistle, high-pitched, almost childlike. It floated on the breeze, an eerie, cheery tune that seemed to skip through the trees. Caleb froze, his heart beating a little faster in his chest. It was the kind of sound you'd expect from a child, playful and light. But it felt wrong. The whistle wasn't natural. It didn't belong in the woods. He stood there for a long time, listening, trying to make sense of it. It was so faint, so delicate, like it was being carried on the wind from somewhere far away. The whistle was almost beckoning, calling him deeper into the woods. Against his better judgment, Caleb followed the sound. The trail seemed to disappear underfoot, but Caleb pushed forward, the trees growing denser and the shadows darker as he made his way through. The whistle grew louder, clearer. It was unmistakable now, a simple melodic tune that seemed to shift and dance on the air, weaving around him like a thread he couldn't avoid. He didn't know how long he walked, or how far, but when night fell, he found himself deep in the heart of the woods. There was no path left now, no trail to follow. It was just him and the sound of the whistle, growing louder, insistent. Then the voice came. A soft murmur, like someone speaking just behind his ear. Caleb froze. The voice wasn't harsh or threatening. It was sweet, almost playful, like the whistle had grown legs and walked up to him. But the words were chilling. "Stay," it whispered. "Stay with me." Caleb turned, looking over his shoulder, expecting to see something. But there was nothing. Just trees. Silence. The whistle had stopped. Suddenly, everything felt wrong. The woods were too quiet, too still. The air seemed to thicken around him. His heart pounded in his chest as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He had to leave. But when he turned around to retrace his steps, the trees seemed to close in on him. The path had vanished. He was lost. Completely, utterly lost. And then he heard it again, the whistle. But this time it wasn't in the distance. It was right behind him. Caleb spun around, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He saw nothing, but the air was thick with the presence of something. Something close enough to touch. He couldn't breathe. The whispers came again. But this time they were not words. They were a promise. "You'll be back. And you'll bring someone else." Caleb didn't return until 3 days later. When he stumbled back into town, his clothes torn, his face haggard, and his eyes wide with something primal, he barely recognized himself. His lips were cracked, his skin dry and sunken. But he was alive. Barely. The locals gathered around him, eyes wide with concern. They asked him what had happened, what he'd seen. But Caleb only stared at them blankly. He didn't say much, just that the woods had told him he could leave, as long as he brought someone else. 2 weeks later, Caleb vanished. He'd left town without a trace, taking nothing with him. His car was still parked where he'd left it. His belongings were gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no notes, no explanation. And then the week after Caleb disappeared, 2 more hikers went missing. Both were experienced and had trekked these woods many times before. They were last seen near a trail that shouldn't exist. By the time the search teams arrived, the trail was gone, like it had never been there at all. There are some paths in the world, old ones hidden deep in the earth, that shouldn't be followed. And there are some voices, carried on the wind, that aren't meant to be heard. Caleb learned that too late. And now every night, the whistle echoes through the trees, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to listen.